Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory today. We'll be arriving at the capital of Heian-kyō, modern-day Kyoto, around the year 980. Among those who lived unnoticed, quietly preserving beauty, sadness, and the elegance of a bygone era, you are a kosho, a personal servant to a noble lady of the Fujiwara clan. The servant's breakfast? Simple, quick, and silent. Usually thin rice porridge, okayu, pickled vegetables and dried fish, straw mat, wooden pillow, and the scent of last night's incense still lingering on your sleeve. Servants must rise before the nobility to prepare the morning rituals. Before we begin, if you genuinely find this a peaceful place to hide at night, please like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure. Just like the rule in old taverns, you stay only if you need a quiet seat. And you know what I love most? Reading the comments and seeing where you're from and what time it is. Whether it's New York or Norway 1 or 5 in the morning, you're still here and I see you. Now turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a little fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but because of that soft humming sound. Heian-kyō, around the year 980. Waking up in the cold and the silence is a ritual. No one wakes you, because you're the one who wakes others. You wake before the sky has time to turn blue. Not because of an alarm, but because a noble cat just stepped on your face. The cat's name is Shiga, and it just strolled across the lady's silk sleeve at 3 in the morning, leaving behind a few hairs and a disdainful look. Shiga, the name means late autumn rain. It was named by a monk, so even though it's a cat, it's technically registered at the temple, and possibly it's the only creature in this palace, accepted equally by the heavens, the people, and poetry. You're not angry, because anger is too loud for this place. You quietly rise from the straw mat bow slightly, as if apologizing to the floor. You take off your clogs from the veranda, not because of dirt, but because the tapping sound could disrupt the poem. Your lady is composing in her mind. Then you step outside, just a few steps, and the wind slips through your layers of thin kimono. A silver mist blurs the stone garden path. The air is so cold, if you breathe too loudly, you might shatter the half-formed poem in the lady's thoughts. You begin your day by not making noise, no brushing teeth, no spitting, no lifting pot lids. You boil tea using dry firewood tied up the night before to avoid crackling sounds. Even the way you stir water is as gentle as someone hiding a sigh in their sleeve. Then you go fetch the pillow, not a soft one, but takamakura, a wooden pillow hard as fate. You must dust it, tilt it exactly 45 degrees toward the sunrise, because once placing it wrong caused the lady to dream of a bad poem. And the next morning, the entire residence fell silent like the funeral of inspiration. You are a servant, but truly, you're like the curtain between emotion and scandal. You must not cry aloud, must not laugh loudly, must not breathe hard, when the lady is remembering someone who no longer remembers her. On a small wooden table, a cherry blossom petal fell during the night. You bow and place it in a bowl of water like a prayer for a tearless day, not because the lady is weak, but because crying would blur the ink on yesterday's poem. When the deep bell echoes from the distant temple, you know it's time to scent her sleeves with incense. You bring a small wooden tray. On it sits a warm water jug for her hands, a soft cloth and a plain wooden comb used only for her. each time you comb her hair, you must bow hands as light as pulling silk from the sky, because if you pull too hard, a poetic inspiration may fall to the floor and never return. That bell is not for waking people. It's to remind those who rise too early that a quiet religion hums behind them. People believe that morning light and temple sounds must come together. One awakens the body, the other awakens past life memories. And so, the day begins, not with a call, but with a silence that smells of incense. And you, as always, are the first to step beyond the curtain, to ensure that every memory in this palace is never spoken too loudly. You won't be carved into history, but you are the one who keeps history from slipping away. Those who eat in front of others are the ones with power, but you eat in the dark and leave no bite marks. You don't remember the last meal you could call a real meal. Only the rice grains stuck to your fingers while carrying trays, the cold porridge left in a smoky corner room. And sometimes, if the lady left behind pickled plums, you'd take a bite, then wrap the rest in paper, like you didn't dare enjoy it all. In Heian-kyō, not everyone could eat publicly. In the Heian court, the main meal was called gozen, usually around the hour of the sheep, about 1 hour past noon, but that was only for those with rank and schedule. A servant like you eats when the work is done, when the rice is cold, and when the poetry is over. A meal was a ritual of hierarchy. The nobles ate from lacquer trays using rosewood chopsticks, starting with seaweed broth, main dish, glutinous rice with smoked fish grilled over peach wood. Dessert was pickled plum, to inspire poetry, because sourness sparks creativity. But you eat from behind the curtain. No sound, no scent, no complaint, and above all, no trace. Your bowl is borrowed, your spoon, split bamboo. Your mealtime is when others are writing verse. Once, you secretly ate a barley sugar candy. The princess forgot in her robe sweet, but it gave you a cough for 3 days, because no one taught you how to eat aristocratic sugar. It wasn't meant to be bitten. You let it melt like a sad poem. The kitchen was set far from the main hall, not for safety, but so the sound of boiling water didn't reach the poet's ear. People might forgive a clumsy verse, but not the clang of chopsticks when moonlight's touching the paper door. Your food is never hot, because you eat last never full, because you eat what's left. Nameless, because no one names hunger, and sometimes it carries the scent of tears, because the meal often comes after a rejection, a bout of jealousy, or a ceremony you weren't invited to. You have a small wooden box hidden beneath the floor. Every long-time maid has one. It's not just to hide food, but to keep memories. A broken comb, a rushed poem, a button from someone you can't name. Because when you have no right to remember out loud, you tuck it into wood inside, some sesame salt, a half-burnt piece of grilled dried fish, and a salted plum you saved from last year. You don't eat it. You open it when you miss the smell of home. That smell wasn't palace. It was damp morning fields, your mother's voice calling for dinner. As the sun dipped behind the hill, there are nights when the palace sleeps. You sit in the cold kitchen, gnawing on rice crackers hard as stone. That kind, katayaki, made from leftover rice and salt saved for night shifts. It's hard because it's been dried for days, hard enough to chew away time. They say, if you can finish one katayaki without cracking your lips, then surely you've got nothing left to regret. It doesn't melt. only softens like a heart used to enduring, and you realize what keeps people going isn't having enough food, but being able to eat alone without feeling like you've disappeared. When you're not allowed to say, "I love," you learn to fold paper. You've seen her holding the paper fan, her hand moving slowly like stroking something she couldn't say aloud. It wasn't summer wind, it was an unwritten poem, trembling between two fingers. In the Heian-kyō, people didn't kiss, didn't hug, didn't hold hands in public. They sent poetry, and if the feeling was strong enough, the poem would send a person. Each proper love poem was folded 16 times, because 16 was the number of rainy seasons of longing, of moon-dim nights on paper porches. The sender would choose thin tanzaku paper, as light as breath soaked with a drop of scent. Tanzaku in Heian times was dyed with natural colors, pink from cherry blossoms, yellow from turmeric root, blue from indigo leaves. And to make every poem unique, each sheet was scented differently. First confession, light incense. Farewell, camphorwood scent. Apology, no scent. So the word stood bare, and folded with steady hands. Then who delivered it? Not a person, a cat. In Hayane-maki scrolls and waka poetry, cats were depicted as sacred messengers of unsaid words. Some court ladies believed, if you can't send a letter through people, send it through a cat, for cats never betray. White cats meant waiting black cats were cooled memories, and some cats roamed their whole lives carrying nothing, just listening to others' poems. You've tied countless papers to palace cats' collars. They walk as if they understood the task. They pace slowly, no side glances, no meows, unless someone rubs their ear too hard. There was a cat named Sho, who often visited the lady next door's garden. It walked like a noble, always wore a silk ribbon around its neck. Changing colours with the seasons. People said it wasn't a cat, but the reincarnated memory of a dancer who left her love story unfinished. You didn't believe until you saw it nibble a paper fan stained with tears. Lovers in Heian didn't look at each other, only at shadows, didn't call names, only wrote, "that person." And if lucky, received a folded reply, 16 creases deep, sent back by cat. One night, you secretly kept a poem that fell in the hallway. No name, only read, "If the moon isn't bright enough for our faces, may the wind not lift the curtain." You kept it like a charm. Poems were often written at the third watch. After palace lights dimmed, writers placed paper on wooden boxes, using moonlight from behind paper doors, because they believed poems written under lamps too easily lied. Only moonlit poems carried truth unwarped by light. Not to love, but to remember someone once waited for someone who never came. Palace people didn't cry out loud. They wrote sad poems. They didn't reject. They wrote poems without replies. You, the one who folds letters, never allowed to open them. But your hands remember each fold, and sometimes the leftover scent of paper skips your heart a beat. Love poems in court were like incense ash. They didn't burn, just smoldered. And anyone who passed by, if quiet enough, could smell the smoke still clinging to the lining of a robe. When you are not allowed to scream, you wear many layers of fabric to trap the sound inside. The morning begins with a gentle rustle of cloth. No bells, no call to rise. Just a subtle gesture, and you must sit up. In the Heian court, people didn't wear a single outfit. The term 12 layers, junihito, is symbolic. In reality, many outfits had from 5 to 20 layers, depending on the season, the ceremony, and the weather, and they could weigh up to 20 kilograms. There is a record of a noblewoman fainting during a wedding ceremony because the outermost layer, the karaginu, was sewn too long, and she couldn't breathe while bowing. They wore 12 layers called junihito, 12 layered robes. But you know, it was more than clothing. It was unspoken language, a mood folded into each layer of silk. You are the lady's dressing maid. Your work begins with breathing, because if you move too quickly, the fabric will twist. If you make a mistake, the colors will fall out of order. In the Heian court, only the upper classes were allowed to use certain dyed colors, like deep indigo, dark purple, or soft gold, called kinari. Lower-ranking court women could only wear muted tones, pastels, without reflectivity. The way colors were layered was not just aesthetic, it was a code of power. Instead of asking, "Who is she?" people only needed to glance at a sleeve to know. And if you exposed the inner layers by mistake, then for the rest of the day, the entire court would know the lady is unwell. The innermost layer, white like the silence of dawn. Then came pale pink for unspoken apologies. Each season had its own color pairing, called Kasein no Irome, the gradation of layered tones: spring, pink plus, white plus, fresh leaves; summer, light blue plus, silver; autumn, brick orange plus, plum purple; winter, ivory plus, smoky blue. If you wore the wrong season, no one would ask if you were cold. They would say, "Her heart seems out of season." Purple, for one who received no reply. Crimson, if she missed the falling leaves. Blue, when she was hoping but dared not admit it. You don't ask what your lady is thinking. You only watch the colors she chooses. And you know today, she is not all right. To wear all the layers, she must stand still like a willow tree, while you move around her like wind, one round, one layer at a time. You smooth the folds, adjust the collar, align the sleeves so that not a single inch spills over, because each time fabric spills out, it means emotion leaked. One day, you saw her collapse while you were still fastening the 8th layer. You didn't say a word. You simply lit a small stick of incense to give yourself a reason to pause. You once heard someone say wearing junihito is an art. The Makura no Soshi. The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon once wrote, "There is nothing more delicate than a sleeve of silk just brushing through a paper screen as the morning wind passes." Such words were not just literature, but living testimony of a world where feelings were folded into pleats. You think, it was a way for someone to melt without anyone seeing. Each layer was a box locking away trembles, anger, longing. And when she steps out, walking down the wooden corridor, others will say, "She is graceful today." No one will say, "She's about to cry." One day you wonder, if she is never allowed to remove those layers, then where will all the things she holds back go? You don't know. You only know. After every dressing, she always touches your wrist, not as thanks, but as if saying, "Please hold for me what the fabric could not." And you hold it silently, like silk. There is a way to survive in the Heian court. Don't move unless you have a reason. And if you don't, sit. Sit like a painting hung in the center of a room, never falling, never making noise, never breathing hard. You, the lady's maid, learned this when you were 11, when you moved your sleeve at the wrong time and knocked over an incense jar placed on the mat. The lady didn't scold you, but from then on, you were only allowed to sit in the corner behind the bamboo curtain. You could not speak unless spoken to. You also couldn't straighten your back. Your posture had to be like winter bamboo, flexible, yet enduring the cold. The proper sitting posture is called Caesar knees, folded tops of feet against the mat, hands lightly placed in front of the stomach, as if holding a secret, and most importantly, your eyes must not glance to the left, because on the left is always someone of a higher rank, and to look is an insult. You once thought sitting still was easy, but after 17 springs, sitting without trembling is an art, because the chill in the court doesn't come from wind, but from stares. A single look can freeze your spine. But you must keep a gentle smile and continue breathing as if you are a willow branch. Once you had a fever. Still, you sat in Caesar for 3 hours to listen to 5-tone poetry. Sweat ran into your collar. You couldn't wipe it. You remembered the Koyo ceremony last year, where noble women sat beneath red maples for hours, simply to admire falling leaves. A yellow leaf landed in your lap. You didn't dare brush it off, because doing so would insult autumn's love confession. You remembered the tale of an old court lady about Fujiwara, no Michitsuna's mother, who once waited for her husband for 3 days without leaving the mat. Never daring to lie down, she once said, "Even if the man doesn't return that night, I must sit as though I am still being loved." And you learned, sometimes sitting still is the only way to prove you exist. If you wipe, it means the poem wasn't beautiful enough to keep others in silence. During banquets, you sit behind a silk screen, only shadows, never faces. The sound of pouring sake, the rustle of paper fans, the laughter of someone without showing teeth. You sit and listen and feel yourself melt like wax. No one notices, because you are not one of the ones to be seen. You once heard the tale of Murasaki no Yue, the woman who never raised her voice in front of men, even when hurt. Once, you asked the old court lady, "How does one not be forgotten when not allowed to speak?" She just smiled and said, "A good girl should not let her footsteps echo on wood." And from then, you learn to walk without sound and sit without ripples. You are simply air wearing kimono. One night, you sat in the corridor, waiting for orders. Moonlight struck your eyes. You couldn't blink, because the sound of eyelids folding might disturb someone's sleep. You once saw a court lady demoted just because she sneezed during a flower viewing. So you learned to breathe without breathing, sit without presence. Use folds of fabric to hide emotions. Use posture to keep yourself from being displaced in the hierarchy. People say Heian was an era of poetry, painting, and ceremony. You think Heian was an era of those who mastered how to disappear with a smile. And that night, when the lady passed by and saw you still sitting in the same posture, she gave no orders. She only whispered, "Leaves too grow tired from standing in place, but they must stay or risk being swept away by wind." You bowed, didn't dare say thank you, just breathed softly, as if you were a leaf. But inside, you were shaking the whole tree. You are not allowed to love, but no one forbids you from thinking about it for 3 full cherry blossom seasons. There is a small wooden box hidden under the mat. No one knows except you and the mat itself. Inside the box are waka poems, 31-syllable verses that you've been writing for the past 3 years. No sender's name, no recipient's name, just words that dare not leave the silk paper. You started writing poetry at the age of 13, after the night your lady received a poem letter from some noble son of the Fujiwara estate. The letter was folded 16 times, placed on a paper fan, gently scented with incense, and tied with a blue silk thread. You once heard, if you fold it wrong or choose the wrong type of paper, the letter could be misunderstood as disrespectful. Letters on purple sandpaper are for royalty. Eucalyptus-coloured paper is for ladies, and dark-coloured ones are for men. Poetry, even unwritten, already bears stricter rules than the laws themselves. Your lady said nothing, just smiled. But you, the one who handed the fan over, felt your heart flutter with the scent, and from that moment, you began to write. You also heard about an old court lady, living quietly in a small room at the end of the east hallway. They say she had once been in love, but never sent a single poem. She only wrote, then burned them. You secretly asked why. She simply replied, "I don't want to reply. I just want the feeling not to rot inside my chest." You didn't fully understand, but you started writing, like her. Not for yourself, but to keep the emotions from cracking the glaze you must wear. You once wrote, "I stand in the rain, not to get wet, but so the sky won't know I'm crying," then folded it so carefully that even you didn't dare open it again. In Heian, no one loves directly. A waka poem sent, if replied to that same night, could be a secret proposal. Many waited all night just to hear the footsteps of a returning poem. If those footsteps never came, then an entire spring inside your heart had to quietly step back, like the final petal falling late. People send poems to test the heart. The receiver would reply in verse that same night if they felt the same. But if silence greeted you by morning, then your heart was buried in a field of lilies with no grave marker. You once saw a court lady secretly send a poem. She had once composed poems for spring ceremonies, so skilled that her name was embroidered on palace invitations. But just once, she sent a personal waka to a high-ranking official without protocol. The poem was intercepted mid-transfer, and instead of a reply, it became evidence. Caught, her name in the palace was changed from Sayuri, white blossom, to Sumi, black ink. No one called her by the old name again, as if past love was a sin beyond cleansing. So you write, but never send, and your love like aged's sake, more fragrant, but sadder too. One night, you dreamt of a hand returning a fan. No face. Just a voice. "I do not write poems, but if you understand the wind, you will hear me." You awoke and wrote an unnamed poem, just one line. The wind from the old bamboo still returns to the place we sat that day. The poem remains unsent, but the emotion has already left. You start to understand. Love in the court needs no reply. It only needs a place to hide. Ink scent, incense smoke, silk paper are the last safe spaces for those forbidden to dream. One morning, you open the wooden box, fold all your poems into the shape of birds, and burn them. Not because you've forgotten someone, but because you want that love, like ash, to fly away, needing no destination. That day, your lady saw you, but didn't ask. She only placed a white plum blossom in front of you. and said, "Not all poems need readers. Some just need to be written, so we remember we still have a heart." You bow, and for the first time, you feel your poem has been sent in a way no one needs to read. Afternoon in Heian comes with no fanfare, just the light retreating along the ebony floor, as if someone is drawing an invisible curtain. You sit before a small teapot. This tea, not the refined tea ceremony of later times, but a drink brought from Chinese monks in the 8th century, used in meditation chambers to keep the mind from weariness. Tea is medicine, a tool for quiet, an unspoken invitation between silent souls. And now, it rests between your hands like an unnamed heirloom. Fingers don't touch the lid, only letting steam gently graze your wrist. A simple ritual, but you know, it is your only way to measure time. Occasionally, in what they call silent tea, court ladies are ordered to brew tea in absolute silence. No words, no excess movements. The only sound is water touching the cup, as if that silence is what's truly being served. And you realize, some afternoons even silence has a flavor, like the slightly bitter taste at the end of the first sip. The lotus tea smells different today, not because of the tea, but because your heart is no longer like yesterday. Tea still comes from dried leaves, but the one brewing it ages a little more each day, like wood bending from humid seasons. You were taught to make tea at 12 years old, not for yourself, but to know how to make it for others. The ratio of water, fire, time must follow the lesson. The woman who taught you said, "Don't let the water boil too much, it will startle the tea. Don't use too many leaves, it will choke the words." Usually 3 parts leaf, 6 parts water, and 1 part silence. That's the recipe in the tea manuals of palace grannies. The cloth to wipe the lid must be silk soaked in scented water, never coarse fabric, because tea doesn't like to be touched roughly, said an old woman who once served under Fujiwara no Michinaga. One wrong movement, and the tea turns bitter. One wrong feeling, and the lady's face tightens, even if she says nothing. One afternoon, just after you finished preparing the tea tray, your lady said, "Today's tea is sad." You flinched, not because of the tea, but because you had just been thinking of an unfinished poem. Heian is a place where all emotions are kept in teacups. No one raises their voice, no one complains, only the sound of the lid tapping the rim, like a gentle warning. Be quiet, so others can still hear themselves. You once heard a court lady was expelled for laughing too loudly while pouring tea. That laugh broke a beautiful emptiness between 2 spells of rain. And so she left the court. No one mentioned her again. Only the teapot was placed on the lower shelf, never used again. You saw it once, a small crack running along the handle, like a faded imprint of memory. No one mentions the name of the woman who laughed anymore. But on humid, rainy days, that pot still clicks faintly, even when empty, as if the sound once hidden inside still echoes through the cracked glaze. You learn to keep your face like a mirror not yet wiped, seeing yourself in it, blurred, but others looking in still find it serene. That is proper. One afternoon, you quietly pour tea into 2 cups. Only you are present. The second cup is for someone who does not exist. You bow your head and whisper, "If you never came, at least let me keep pouring." The water cools, but the cup remains full. Light pulls away from the tatami mat. You know, the afternoon is over, and loneliness, once again, is sealed beneath the porcelain lid. You don't have poetry paper, no brush, no right to write. You are one of the kikimimi onna, those called the listening ears, tasked with memorizing every verse, every love letter, every sigh wrapped in syllables. No one writes your name down, but you are where poetry is stored. You're not allowed to compose, but you're obligated to remember, like a living scroll that must not tear or stray. Your name doesn't appear in the list of poetesses honored at the Spring Poetry Festival. You only stand behind the ones invited, holding a fan, eyes fixed toward the sun, because if you look up when the lady reads, they'll say you're impolite. You hear it all, remember it all, but no one asks what you think. Heian is the age of written words, of 31-syllable waka, of people who only love through paper and part ways with a semicolon, but also the age of you, who must memorize hundreds of poems to recite when your mistress needs an example, yet must never let your own heart bleed through the lines. Your lady once asked, "Whose poem do you remember best?" You replied, "The one written by someone in love. Those are impossible to forget." She laughed, then asked, "Have you ever been in love?" You didn't answer, just took one step back, like shielding yourself from the sun, but really to avoid meeting her gaze. There's a waka. You've remembered since you were 13. Leaves fall, but your name still lingers like dew on a sleeve, though this morning had no dew. No one knows the author. Could be someone long gone, or someone never allowed to sign their name. You once saw a court woman silently burn her own poems, leaving nothing but ash. She had been a servant skilled enough that the lady once asked her to ghostwrite. But when one of her verses was accidentally selected at a banquet, without her mistress's name attached, she was reprimanded for outshining the one she served. From then on, she stopped writing, only burned, and stayed silent like a wall with ears but no mouth. When asked why, she only said, "Because in this palace, poetry from the lowborn becomes evidence more easily than a keepsake." You began secretly recording others' poetry, not on paper, but by folding towels. You once heard that during the Fujiwara court, some women hid poems by folding outer robes in off-center pleats, each side representing a poetic beat. A robe folded in 3 creases meant waiting for a reply. A collar folded tight around the neck meant silence, forever. You dared not go that far, only towels. But still, your heart skipped a beat each time you folded the final crease. 3 creases meant a sad poem. Some said folding a towel into a crescent moon shape meant hoping for a letter from someone long gone. You tried that once, then crushed it, scared someone would mistake it as a poem sent. After that, you only folded them straight, neat and rigid, like truths that cannot be said. One vertical fold meant anger, only you knew. Each time you washed the towel, you erased a poem never written. Sometimes you wonder, will anyone someday remember poems heard only once in the dark? Will anyone understand that? Those forbidden to compose were often the ones who bore the weight of others' poetic memories. One night, you woke at midnight, not from bells, but from a poem, old as your grandmother's breath, suddenly returning to your mind. You wrote it on your palm with a wet finger, then clenched it tight, as if held long enough, it might follow you into a dream. Heian is the time of silks and floral speech. But you know, behind those layers are servants, unallowed to make poetry, only to remember, and eventually to be forgotten, just like Waka, with no reply. You learn to walk in the dark, without fire, without sound, not because you're brave, but because fire is a privilege and sound leaves traces. In the inner palace, some hallways are so long, people count by breaths, not steps. You're used to walking in shadows, hand lightly brushing wood walls, eyes toward the unlit side. Sometimes you even follow someone else's shadow, because of the Hikage no Kaji rule that forbids low-ranking maids from letting light fall directly on their face. Illuminating yourself means seeking attention, a thing deemed disrespectful if you lack status. You learn to be the shadow of a shadow, and within that, learn how to exist unnoticed. Because in Heian, not every space has the right to hold a flame. Your lady loves reading Waka in soft silk light, beside a lantern just bright enough for one arm. Sometimes she uses yakoshi paper, camphor oiled, so that when lit by candlelight, the letters glow. You watch those characters flare up and disappear in smoke, as if someone is whispering from another world, in a voice never meant to speak aloud. You sit silently behind her, not to protect, but to wonder, is tonight's poem sadder than yesterday's? In an autumn ritual, you're assigned to light the ceremonial candles. But once, you had followed a monk to Gion Temple during the Tomio, the lantern offering to Buddha. No one was allowed to speak loudly. People walked barefoot, each carrying a small oil lamp, writing a loved one's name or prayer on paper, then lighting it in silence. That was the first time you saw light so small, and still considered enough to illuminate a belief, enough to uphold a promise to the gods. Not with fire, but with a bronze mirror reflecting moonlight. They called it borrowing the sky's light, because artificial light insulted the divine. Your hand shook, because the moon isn't always full, and mirrors not always clean. But the ritual continued, in hazy light, like a quiet confession. Sometimes, not seeing clearly is part of reverence. You once thought darkness was something to fear, but in Heian, it is where people whisper love, where prayers remain private. Night tea ceremonies, poetry offerings, silent readings, all take place in near total darkness. You were taught not to breathe heavily, because breath might tremble the only flame. You say nothing. But once, you were asked to recite a poem for your lady during Mimi Yomi no Rei, where poetry is heard, not seen. You read each line in total darkness, not knowing who wrote it, nor who was listening. Yet you still remember that poem, every beat, every sound. And even now, you repeat it silently, as a way to keep what no one allowed you to keep. You understand, darkness, if entered rightly, is not a place of fear, but a curtain, protecting what is too fragile for light. Heian isn't the age of brilliance. It is the age of things gentle, slow, and nearly vanished. You once saw a court official cry when the candle went out while reading a poem to the Empress. No one relit it. It meant the gods no longer wished to listen. And so, the rite ended, in silence. No one spoke. Only you, the servant who lit the flame, remained seated a little longer, looking into the dark, not to see, but to remember that some things when gone leave no ashes, only the feeling that light was once there. You once thought crying was for moments when no one was looking, but in Heian, people cried as part of aesthetics. The people of Heian called it mono no aware, beauty lying in the fleeting, in the moment that brushes against sadness without clinging to it, not to be pitied, but to be seen as a wisp of dew melting in morning sunlight, not a sobbing sound, but gently wet eyes looking at a fallen flower, a wrist softly brushing the sleeve, as if wiping away something that hasn't quite fallen. Your lady once read a poem by Ariwara no Narihira, a famed romantic poet, and said nothing more. She just smiled slightly and reapplied powder. Her hand folded the letter using the uchu fold, a way reserved for soft refusals. You noticed that, but acted like you didn't, because in the palace, rejection didn't come through words. It came through how the letter was folded, with no edge visible. You knew she was hiding something. Because that letter, for the first time, had a faint smudge like water. No one asked. No one was allowed to ask, because to ask would shatter the beauty wrapped in fragility. They said women were most beautiful when crying without sound, because once sound breaks out, the emotion has become pain. But true beauty lies on the edge between not saying it and not being able to bear it anymore. You once saw court women quietly tucking rejected love letters into their long sleeves. Whoever could hold on the longest without folding, crumpling, or crying was seen as the more graceful one. The beauty wasn't in the sadness. It was in how you wrapped it, tucked it into your sleeve, and walked across the stone courtyard as if nothing had ever been received. One time you truly cried, not because someone died, but because a poem you ghost wrote was returned unopened. You weren't allowed to write poetry for yourself, but you had once copied a line by Izumi Shikibu. She dreamed of him and wept upon waking, but if he came for real, would she still have tears left to cry? So each line was borrowing someone else's name to speak your own story. And when the other person didn't read it, you lost both, your voice and your reason to whisper. You stepped into the hallway, bowed your head for a long time. A tear fell. You wiped it with your sleeve, because in Heian, sleeves weren't just to keep warm. They were where you hid tears, as if hiding a secret not allowed to drift on the wind. There was an entire poetic form called sodwo nurasu, sleeves wet with tears, where emotion didn't need words. Just a piece of fabric was enough to hold it. Then bow to a passing official, as if you had merely dropped a leaf. In Heian, even emotions had rules, even tears. The most beautiful tears were the ones that knew when not to fall. Morning arrived with the sound of brooms sweeping gravel. No one woke you. You just knew it was morning. When a slant of light cut across the shoji paper and the scent of incense from the main room quietly crept into your sleeve. In Heian, there was no alarm bell, only the rhythm of rituals. A court lady brews tea. Another brings the second layer of robes. The lady still sits in the half-light, hair unbrushed. And you, like every day, kneel behind the screen, nameless, voiceless, never allowed to look directly. Time didn't pass by the hour. It passed through poems. Each finished poem marked another hour gone. a slip of poetry laid in the sun, meant the morning had passed. And if someone wrote a poem that was never answered, then their afternoon never arrived. You once sat still for an entire hour just to refold a sleeve, because one fold had shifted, and if it peeked out, others might think you were hiding something. The Heian people read your folds to gauge your mood, and read the space between seats to measure closeness. No one said it aloud, but everyone read each other like a silent poem. Evening came with the sound of a distant biwa lute. No one played music to listen. They played to divide time. A long, drawn note meant it was time to light the lamp. One time, you saw your lady stare at the lamp unlit. You didn't ask. You quietly brought a sprig of night-blooming jasmine, as if to say, "If the night has come, please don't be afraid." She didn't answer, just nodded, and lit the lamp, as if you had said something right. Night in Heian wasn't black. It was the color of ink still drying, of sleeve shadows falling on the floor, of breaths barely escaping, like wind through thin paper. You finished writing a poem for someone else and placed it down. Didn't sign your name, because you weren't allowed to be named in poems. And just like that, the day passed, like a poem without an ending. No one closed it. No one dared write the final line. Only sleeves grew heavier, and your heart slowly learned that some poems, even if unread, were still poems, because you were the one who had held them all day long. You weren't born to choose your place. You were born to complete it until your final breath. Imagine ancient Japanese society as a multi-layered mochi cake. The top layer is soft, white, and fragrant with new rice. The middle layer is chewy, dense, full of pressure. The bottom layer is the one pressed closest to the ground, yet it's what holds the entire cake together. This cake is not shared equally. It is shaped by what the Japanese called the sacred order, where everyone knows their place, and the worst thing you could do is step into someone else's piece of the cake. The emperor, or Tenno, was considered a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. He did not rule. He existed, like a sacred flame placed in a shrine. It does not warm, it does not cook, but it must never go out. He was the ceremonial center, the cultural soul, the one who lives forever in the hearts of the people. Except, every decision was made by someone else. People bowed to him, brought tributes, wrote poems for him. But outside, the country was being torn apart by warlords who didn't need poetry, only blood and power. He was the sun, but the true power was hidden behind an iron cloud. Compared to the Heian era, from the year 794 to 1185, when the emperor still held symbolic influence in politics and patronized literature and art. By the Kamakura period, he became little more than a figure seated behind a curtain. This shift in power didn't happen with a loud coup, but through centuries of gradually dimming the throne's light. From then on, Japan entered an era where the one sitting highest didn't rule, but the one who wrote the laws, led the armies, and collected the taxes. If the emperor was a deity standing on an altar, then the shogun was the man in the meeting room, with a sword in hand and taxes on his mind. The shogun was the supreme military commander, holding full control over politics, the military, and the economy. They created their own government, the bakufu, like a massive corporation with hundreds of branches called daimyo. The shogun didn't need to be loved. They needed to be obeyed. No one called them father of the people. They were simply called the one who could turn your entire family to ash by lunchtime. They ruled with the sword, but kept society upright with fear. One of the first shoguns was Minamoto no Yoritomo, the man who founded the Kamakura shogunate and set the precedent that real power didn't need a crown. He didn't sit in the capital. He sat in Kamakura, running the country like a general in battle. Under his rule, the shogun's power far surpassed the emperor's, and Japan officially entered the era of military governance. Each daimyo was like a medieval European lord, except they wore kimonos, carried two swords, and could order a beheading without asking anyone's permission. Daimyo owned land, armies, peasants, and their own laws. If you lived in a kind daimyo's domain, you might eat fresh rice. If not, you ate radish peels and prayed there'd be no floods next season. The relationships between daimyo were like a giant game of Go. One wrong move, and you could lose an entire region. One misplaced word, and you could ignite a war that lasted a century. In this mochi-layered society, daimyo were the filling, sweet, but also dangerous. You never knew if that sweetness came laced with poison. A prime example was Oda Nobunaga, a famous daimyo of the Warring States period. He didn't just break the aristocratic rules. He burned Buddhist temples, upgraded firearms, and began unifying Japan with iron and fire. Oda didn't believe in power that came from ritual. He believed in speed, fear, and the ability to make people fall silent. But there were other daimyo, like Wasugi Kenshin, called the dragon god of Echigo, a brilliant general who lived an ascetic life like a monk. He didn't drink alcohol, had no wives or concubines, and once sent rice to feed his enemies. The contrast between Oda and Wasugi shows. Not all power is built with steel. Some comes from virtue, respect, and the ability to control oneself in chaos. Samurai were both terrifying and pitiful. They carried honor, death, philosophy, and sometimes last night's cold meal. Their ideal was Bushido, the way of the warrior. Live with loyalty, die with ceremony, do not complain, and know how to write poetry while bleeding from a stomach wound. They didn't just fight, they were taught how to die. And not die because they lost, but because they failed to bow low enough, or because their eyes looked wrong to a superior. Samurai were the clearest proof of this saying. In ancient Japan, dying properly was more important than living long. A prime example is Miyamoto Musashi, a legendary swordsman of the Edo period who won over 60 duels and never died in any. But instead of choosing ceremonial death like many others, he went into seclusion, wrote books, like the Book of Five Rings, and became a symbol of the shift from blade to intellect. Musashi's story shows, not all samurai die for honor. Sometimes, living long enough to understand honor is harder. On the other hand, there were samurai like Saigo Takamori, known as the Last Samurai. After failing in a rebellion against the Meiji government, he chose death by seppuku, ritual suicide, to preserve the spirit of Bushido in a world that was beginning to leave the samurai behind. Saigo's death wasn't just the end of a rebellion, it was a farewell to an entire era when the sword was no longer law, and loyalty no longer paid in honor. You weren't born to ask questions. You were born to bow at the right angle, step in the right place, breathe quietly, and pass through life like a wisp of tea smoke. If you want to live long, stay silent. If you want to be remembered, die beautifully. And if you want to understand this mochi cake, go to the bottom layer, where the real burden lies. If you can swing a sword and still write poetry, you are a samurai. If not, you're just a hired killer. Nowhere else in the world was there a warrior class as strict as scripture, and as fragile as old verse, like in ancient Japan. Samurai weren't just armor-wearing, horse-riding stormbringers. They were the embodiment of a living philosophy. Bushido, the way of the sword and the way of the heart. They learned how to kill, and at the same time, how to watch petals fall without crying. In the turbulent years, from Kamakura to Edo, the samurai were the pillars of order. But not an order of voices, an order of silence, of ceremony, of accepting death without complaint. From snow-buried battlefields in Hokkaido to the hushed wooden hallways of daimyo castles, they were present like shadows, always ready to disappear. You might find a samurai swinging a sword, but you might also find him by the hearth, writing a 3-line poem about a dream that melted in the fog. A leaf falls, my blade trembles, the wind has shifted. That's not just poetry, that's an inner alarm. In many cases, samurai had to learn classical Chinese characters, waka poetry, tea ceremony, calligraphy, and Confucian philosophy, alongside horseback riding and swordsmanship. A warrior could not be complete if he didn't know how to quietly read a poem before the enemy even showed up. In a society where death was seen as a way to fulfill honor, the samurai lived as if every day were a final farewell. The seppuku ritual wasn't a grand tragic play. It was the rite of absolute silence. When a samurai knelt, placed his hand on the tanto blade, and wrote his final words with trembling strokes, it wasn't surrender, it was a declaration. I do not let others write my ending. They left no fortune. They left style, the way they stood, the way they poured tea, the way they slowly drew their blade, and the way they looked at someone one last time before opening their belly. But not all samurai were the same. Even within this class, there were divisions. Samurai with masters lived in castles, respected. Ronin, masterless samurai, unemployed, making a living teaching swordsmanship, working as bodyguards, or sometimes turning to banditry. If a samurai with a master was a shaded tree in a walled garden, then a ronin was a dry leaf blown by the wind, never knowing when to stop, and never sure if anyone remembered them. Some lost everything simply because their lord died in battle, and just like that, from warrior to ghost. A prime example is Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary swordsman of the Edo period, who won over 60 duels without dying once. But instead of choosing ritual death like many others, he retired, wrote books, the Book of 5 Rings, and became a symbol of shifting from sword to mind. Musashi's story shows, not every samurai dies for honor. Sometimes, living long enough to understand what honor means is harder. On the other hand, there were samurai like Saigo Takamori, called the last samurai. After his failed rebellion against the Meiji government, he chose seppuku. ritual suicide, to stay true to the spirit of Bushido, in a world that was slowly leaving the samurai behind. Saigo's death wasn't just the end of an uprising. It was a goodbye to an entire era when the sword was no longer law and loyalty no longer paid with honor. There's no great monument for the nameless samurai who fell in silence. But every time you read a sad haiku, every time you see a cherry blossom fall, that's how they whisper, "I was here." You won't find them in ancient texts, not in love poems or gold-stitched ceremonies. But if you strip away all the grandeur, all the swords, all the geisha fans, what remains is them. They had no right to speak, no permission to stand as equals. But every brick beneath each castle had their sweat soaked into it. Who were they? They were the farmers planting rice during famine, the blacksmiths swinging hammers in winter, the artisans weaving silk for the court, without ever wearing a proper robe themselves. The lower class of ancient Japanese society, from Heian to Edo, were not the edge of civilization. They were its foundation, but a foundation forced to stay silent. Not the geisha, not the white kimono nobles walking to shrines, but the midwife, the girl carrying water, the mother hiding sorrow behind tear-salted meals. They mastered every skill needed to keep a home warm, yet had no right to keep their voice. When war came, they mended their husband's armor. When festivals came, they lit lanterns praying for their lords, not their own children. No one wrote their names in the chronicles, but if they stopped working for just a day, even the palace would freeze. Some people don't write history, but they mold it into form, with pottery, with silk, with quiet stitches. The potters of Bison, Shigaraki, Raku chose the clay, fired the kiln, then placed their hearts into each bowl and cup, which they never got to use. The weavers of Nishijin embroidered cherry blossoms onto noble robes, even as spring was washed away from their village by floods. The fan makers painted the floods that swept their hometown, then folded them into fans for samurai to use on dates. When forbidden to speak, they told stories through their hands. When forbidden to write, they left thoughts in brushstrokes and glaze. And when those items broke, vanished, or wore with time, a piece of their soul faded too. When fireworks lit the Kyoto sky, when Tanabata lanterns glowed softly on old streets, where were they? Not in the procession, not receiving the gifts. They were the ones carrying the shrine platform, the ones sweeping trash after it ended, the ones lighting lanterns, then stepping out of frame. Their children didn't wear yukata. Their wives didn't stroll under hanging lights. They watched the festival through the door crack, while their hands were still in dishwater. And the cruelest part was, they were used to it. They smiled when forgotten, because they knew if they rebelled, the whole village would be labeled disrespectful. Ancient Japanese history isn't short on uprisings, from the Kakitsu revolt of the year 1428 to the Iko-Iki movements. The people demanded food, demanded rest, demanded to live, and were crushed. The shogun sent troops. Bans were issued. The names of rebels weren't recorded. They were burned with the debt papers. Even complaining about heavy taxes could get your mouth shut for good. Blacksmiths weren't allowed to say a sword broke due to flawed design. Fishermen weren't allowed to complain about poisoned seas. And slowly, silence became a survival skill, a kind of ritual, a kind of culture. They were taught, don't speak unless asked. And they learned to hide their stories in woven waves, in glazed cracks, in folk songs no one transcribed. When you see an old folding fan, you might feel a gentle sadness, without knowing why. It's just there. It might be because the artisan stitched regret into the paper. It might be because a mother whispered a lullaby into it before sending it away. The people at the bottom of ancient Japan were never named, but without them, no spring could be preserved. Without them, every kimono was just cloth, every tea ceremony just hot water, and every proud declaration of honor just an empty echo. They walked slowly through history, as if not wanting to get in anyone's way, not because they had nothing to say, but because everything they ever uttered was carried off by the wind before anyone could write it down. From the Heian period, where noble ladies wrote poetry behind curtains, to the Edo era, where women sold fish in open markets, ancient Japanese women were always present, but never appeared in the history books. Some gave birth and died in silence. Some raised 3 generations of samurai, yet no one remembered their name. Some spent their lives weaving only mourning cloth, and never once wore one for themselves. The Heian period, often seen as the golden age of Japanese female intellect. Noble women like Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon could write, compose poetry, and express their emotions with language so beautiful it stunned future generations. But that was just a small fraction of a very small group. The rest were millions of women who never learned to read or write. They thought in images, loved through actions, and endured in silence. They had no paper to write letters, no address to send them to. They embroidered on their sleeves so their lovers could see it as they parted. They wrote on paper fans, then spread them open, then closed them, then burned them. Japanese history holds a strange reverence. Women were praised for their silence, for their sacrifice, for a beauty like a cherry blossom that never had the chance to bloom. The less they spoke, the more they were praised. The better they stepped back, the more they were honored. And so, the true voices were never truly heard. From the Kamakura period onward, many customs were established to gradually make women disappear from public spaces. They had to wear veils outdoors, walk behind their husbands, were banned from martial arts, from holding swords, from entering major temples unless given permission. And the heartbreaking part is, many believed that was how it should be. They envied the fourth wife, but never dared to argue. They knew their husband had a child with the maid, but still served dinner gracefully. They cried into the soup, then added a bit of ginger so he wouldn't notice the saltiness. In many rural areas, when a girl was born, the house wouldn't raise a flag like they did for boys. No celebratory drinks, just a sigh. A girl will leave the family one day. But those very daughters later built new homes, cared for their in-laws, gave birth to the next generation, and still never had their names recorded in the family registry. Not every woman in ancient Japan was forbidden from wielding a sword. A few, very few, rose with wooden swords and armor. They were called onabugeisha. Female warriors, often wives or daughters of samurai. They didn't just embroider flowers, they slashed intruders. Didn't just play the lute, they mastered the naginata, a curved blade spear, to protect their families. Tomo Gozen was one of them. A female warrior mentioned in the chronicles of the Genpei War. She was described as beautiful, but stronger than 10 men. Yet Tomo was the exception. No one built sword schools for girls after her. No one wrote the stories of women who stood guard on castle walls while their husbands were at war. History preserved only a few names to prove women could too. The rest of the female warriors, names never recorded. Not all women were born to be wives. Some were sold as children, traded for a sack of rice or a family's debt. They entered Laki. Yukaku, government-sanctioned red light districts, isolated from the rest of society. There, their real names vanished. Only stage names, makeup, and contracts with no exit remained. High-class courtesans, called Heian Kaiji, Oiran, didn't just sell their bodies. They had to master poetry, calligraphy, conversation, tea-making, fragrances, and the shamisen. They were symbols of beauty, but also proof that captivity could be wrapped in velvet. Every outing, Oiran wore 8-inch heels, walked slowly, hips swaying, like a living play. Each night, they redid their makeup, as if today did not continue from yesterday. No one asked, do they get to go home? Because red light districts had no back doors, and people came there to forget, not to remember. Many courtesans died young, some by suicide. The rest grew old cleaning floors in the very places where they were once stars. No history book recorded their names, only woodblock prints, occasionally capturing their gait, but never their eyes. From ancient times, Shinto Shenne believed everything had a spirit, including women. Some women, called Miko, served as priestesses, connecting this world with the divine. But unlike male monks whose names entered history, Miko rarely had names of their own. They danced in festivals, exorcised spirits, prayed for rain and harvests. But when the ceremony ended, they returned to the back halls and disappeared. Many Miko were not allowed to marry. Some were daughters of poor families, sent to shrines as children. They spent their lives with the gods, yet no one worshipped them when they died. From the Edo period on, the role of Miko faded. Many were forced into fortune-telling, dancing at village festivals, surviving on offerings, and sometimes pity. They were the sacred pushed to the margins, the ones who prayed for entire villages, yet had no one to pray for them when they fell ill. And then, they too became names no one remembered. Only the wind chimes in the shrine's corner, occasionally ringing strangely on windless days. From the Nara period, Japanese women were banned from using classical Chinese characters, the language of men in law, scripture, and official texts. But instead of silence, they created a new script, kana, soft, simplified, melodious characters to write poetry, diaries, and inner feelings. It was kana that gave birth to masterpieces like The Tale of Genji, The Pillow Book, and hundreds of waka poems never formally recognized. They did not speak in court, so they wrote in shadows. They weren't allowed to read laws, so they wrote their own for emotion. They couldn't teach publicly, so they passed knowledge through fans, flutes, and curtains. But with time, even the script they created was taken back. Kana later became a tool to teach children and common women, and was again seen as emotional language. Women created a way to be heard, only to be silenced by it, They wrote it down once, so they wouldn't have to say it again. They wrote for themselves and never sent it. And sometimes, all that remained of their existence was a 3-line poem in a book with no author listed. No one praises women who keep the hearth. No one writes poems about those who arrange flowers to match the wind. But they were the ones who let each season pass quietly, without breaking. When war came, they led the children away. When crops failed, they gave up their share. When husbands returned from battle, they hid their tears, swallowed blame, and asked only, "Are you hungry?" Some women never got to choose, but they always knew how to preserve a family, a tradition, a bit of calm amid storms. No monuments were built for them, no names carved in stone. But if you ask who comes to mind first when you think of homeland, maybe it's them, because they didn't need to be remembered to exist. They just needed to keep the light at home from going out. And sometimes that was enough. There was no Bible, no almighty deity sitting on a throne of white clouds, no final judgment or fire of hell calling. The religion of ancient Japan was a breeze, a mossy stone by the path, a tree leaning by the edge of the rice field that no one dared cut because they believed a spirit was sitting inside. In the 6th century, a strange wind blew in from afar. It carried bronze statues of the Buddha, scriptures in Chinese characters, and a new concept: enlightenment. Buddhism, which had taken shape in India, passed through China and Korea, quietly stepped into Japan, and instead of conflict, it whispered to Niko. Shinto. There was no religious war, just a conversation. Shinto taught you to bow to stone. Buddhism taught you to let go of the stones inside your heart. One held the invisibility of nature, the other the impermanence of consciousness. And so, the Japanese chose both. They built temples right next to shrines. They invited both Kami and Buddha to attend weddings, funerals, and harvest festivals. They didn't need a unified ideology. They needed peace in their hearts. Thus, monks in robes began teaching children to read. Buddha statues were placed in moss gardens where the tree spirit still dwelled. And in a small house in the village, you might see a little altar with a Buddha statue, a painting of a fox, and a bowl of rice placed before both every morning. Ancient Japanese people didn't just worship gods in mountains, rivers, or trees. They believed even lifeless objects, if kept long enough, also had souls. The rice bowl used every day, the paper fan that shaded the summer sun, the chopsticks that picked up every grain of rice through childhood. All of them, one day, would grow old, and then awaken. That was the concept of Mantsukumogami. When an object reaches 100 years old, it could come to life, with thoughts, feelings, and even resentment if discarded carelessly. So the Japanese never threw old things away like trash. They held thank you ceremonies for them. They brought broken needles to temples during the Harikuyu ceremony, burying them in soft tofu. They burned old dolls so the spirits inside could be freed. And in the pages of folklore, if you ever find a teapot walking or an umbrella singing, don't laugh, because to them, that's more believable than a politician keeping a promise. Ancient Japanese people didn't build grand cathedrals. They lit incense for the kitchen god, placed a small mirror at the altar, not to reflect their faces, but to remind themselves the god in the house might just be us, if we live rightly. In every kitchen corner could dwell a kami. People cleaned the kitchen not just for hygiene, but out of reverence. They offered hot rice to the kitchen god each morning as a way of saying, "Thank you that there is still rice today." The gods didn't need gold. They needed the steady repetition of gratitude. And if you ever entered a traditional Japanese home, where everything was neatly arranged, carefully cleaned, understand this: it wasn't just aesthetics, it was the belief that beauty is itself a form of ritual. Every spring, people across the land would celebrate Shunki Taisai, the spring festival at Ise Shrine, where ancestral spirits were invited to dine with their descendants. No long speeches, no elaborate rituals, just white rice, dried fish, a few flowers, offered in silence. Japanese religion didn't ask you to kneel, but asked you to remember, and to keep every bowl, every corner of the yard clean. Because wherever cleanliness remains, there a soul can dwell. In Shinto, death is not an end, but a transformation. There is no heaven, no hell, only the world of the Kokami, where the souls of the departed continue, if remembered properly. Ancient Japanese funerals were not for weeping, but to restore purity. Death created inkegare defilement, and the family had to perform purification rites, not just for the deceased, but for the living as well. They hung white flags. They sprinkled salt on themselves after leaving the funeral to dispel the cold air clinging from the spirit world. They avoided visiting others right after a funeral for fear of bringing bad luck. Shinto had no grand cemeteries, just a small stone set in a quiet place, a stick of incense lit each morning, and a whisper to the wind, "I'm doing okay today." In ancient Japan, you didn't need to build a statue to make someone live on. You just had to remember to pass by the flowering tree they once loved most every spring. You won't find grand feasts in ancient Japanese paintings. No giant roasted pigs, no golden forks or crystal glasses. But you will see a properly served bowl of rice, a pair of chopsticks placed straight, a steaming bowl of soup, like a whisper from the earth. To the ancient Japanese, eating was not just to live, it was to give thanks, and to fued, keep order. A typical meal for the peasant class, the backbone of society, included only white rice, miso, and pickled vegetables. Having a dried fish would make the whole family gasp in awe. And strangely, within that poverty, every meal was still carefully arranged, not because of guests, but because of gods. Placing chopsticks the wrong way was disrespectful. Not inviting the kitchen god before eating was irreverent. And leaving rice in the bowl, it was an insult to those who grew it in storm and wind. For the aristocracy, the meal became a miniature stage of culture. From the Heian period, palace banquets were held to the rhythm of Geichoi waka poetry, the sound of vei biwa lutes, and the way of tea. Tea was not just for drinking, it was for sitting still, for watching the steam rise and reflecting on impermanence, for quietly stirring the water clockwise, as if turning oneself with the flow of time. And the food didn't have to be abundant, just the right flavor, the right season, the right way of placing it on a simple wooden tray. Because if it was too ostentatious, they believed the god inside your belly would leave. From the Kamuromachi period, the art of yikaiseki was born, not to fill the stomach, but to satisfy the soul. Each dish was a small painting, a slice of fish representing autumn, a sprig of grass symbolizing regret. The diner didn't just taste, but listened, observed and felt. The meal was no longer material. It was an aesthetic play where the chef was the director and the chopsticks the lines of silent dialogue. From the lowest to the highest classes, every meal in ancient Japanese society shared one spirit: humility. For the samurai, sometimes the final meal took place in silence, in a seppuku, ritual. The food was often just white rice, accompanied by a cup of sake. No meat, no fish, because one about to leave this world must not be burdened by earthly flavors. Sitting upright, staring into the rice bowl, they ate not out of hunger, but out of respect for death arriving like a familiar guest. And sometimes, that very meal, plain and quiet, was when they felt it most clearly. Life is a banquet we all must leave sooner or later. You eat not to assert status, but to remember you are borrowing from the earth, from the water, from the seasons, and from the wife who rose early to cook, though no one remembers her name. A meal, then, was never just a matter of the stomach. Even in weddings among the samurai or imperial family, the feast wasn't only a celebration, it was a social declaration. Every dish was first offered to the ancestors as a silent prayer between two family lines. Each lift of chopsticks was a beat in the symphony of duty, affection, and honor. And if the bride laughed too loudly, or the soup grew cold before the appointed time, that wasn't a small mistake. It was a crack in the honor of the entire family. It was a meeting between the body and the land, between the family and the ancestors, between a person and what they had forgotten. And if there was a religious lesson in every ancient Japanese meal, perhaps it was this: to eat is the meditation of one who cannot sit still. Bowing the head, to the ancient Japanese, wasn't blind obedience. It was a way of life. An apology without justification. A gratitude that needed no praise. One bow was to see more clearly what lay beneath your feet: the earth, the ancestors, and those who came before. Ancient Japanese society was a symphony of order, where each person held their place and each role had meaning. Whether you were a rice farmer, a swordsmith, a geisha playing the biwa, or simply a mother tying her child's sash, you still belonged to a structure breathing with meditative rhythm. Not everyone could speak, but everyone was watched. Not everyone was recorded, but everyone left something behind, on a sleeve, in a patch of mud, or in a glance whose name no one remembers. And maybe that is what allowed ancient Japan, though old, strict and layered, to preserve its quiet beauty. A beauty that needs no fanfare, no proof. Just a bow, and you see it.